हाय फ्रेंड्स, वेलकम बैक। तो अभी हम देखेंगे हाउ हार्ड इज इंडियाज हार्डेस्ट एंट्रेंस एग्जाम, हार्डर देन यूएस एग्जाम। चलो देखें कौन सा हार्डेस्ट एंट्रेंस एग्जाम दे रहे हैं ये। तो चलो वीडियो शुरू करते हैं। वीडियो शुरू करने से पहले अगर आप चैनल पर नए हो और आपने अभी तक सब्सक्राइब नहीं किया तो जल्दी से पहले सब्सक्राइब के बटन और बेल आइकन को क्लिक कर लो ताकि आपको हमारे सारे न्यू वीडियोस के नोटिफिकेशन मिल जाए जैसे हम अपलोड करें।
अगर आपको वीडियो पसंद आता है प्लीज लाइक एंड शेयर। चलिए शुरू करते हैं।
They should not make kids this young have to learn this much stuff. And even though this isn't necessarily the hardest test for someone who's graduated college, ridiculous amount of respect for being able to do this. So in some of my previous videos, my Anime Doro video and my MIT Orgo exam video, a lot of people commented things like, oh, Indian kids have to study 15 hours a day for the JEE, or things like, oh, Indian kids learn this in grade 11, right? So after I heard this, I was like, what the heck is the JEE? So I decided to take a look into it myself. Now, I'm currently a US medical student, so I've taken my fair share of tricky exams. So I want to see if this is one of those situations where it's like an Asian parent bragging about how much their son studies, or if this is actually the real deal and actually a very difficult exam. Now, the JEE
मैंने भी यही
is the
सुना है,
Indian
JEE बहुत
Engineering
But he's taking
Entrance
medical,
Exam,
right?
and it stands for Joint Entrance Exam. From what I hear, there are two tests, the JEE Main and the JEE Advanced. So if you score high enough on the JEE Main, around the 99th percentile or so, you get to take the JEE Advanced. And if you score high enough on the JEE Advanced, you can qualify to get into schools like IIT, which is equivalent to the MIT of the which is equivalent to the MIT of India.
MIT
Now,
of
the
India?
JEE Main
MIT
is
of
split
US.
into 3 sections and 2 separate papers. So the 3 sections are math, physics, and chemistry. And then there are 2 papers. Each of these papers are 3 hours long, meaning you get a little bit over 2 minutes per question. In today's video, I'm going to be going over the JEE Advanced, just trying to do some of it, looking over some of the problems, and hopefully showing you guys some of it, and just giving my general thoughts on how difficult I think this exam actually is. I'm not actually going to be taking the whole thing because, first of all, it's 6 hours long. I don't have that much time on my hands. But next of all, because I'm a little bit rusty on some of these topics, I just want to compare it to the difficulty of what I know a US test is like, and see if this just completely blows it out of the water, or if it's a little bit overrated.
एग्जाम के लिए रेडी मत। ओके, टाइम टू डू सम प्रॉब्लम्स। हमें भी दिखाओ किस टाइप की प्रॉब्लम है, तो समझ ही नहीं आनी। मैथ सेक्शन मल्टीपल चॉइस होता है, क्या होता है?
Now, first off, we're going to start with the math section. And with the math section, you could already see that this test isn't necessarily impossible. It's just very tricky. You're being tested on a very wide range of math, from Algebra 2 all the way up to calculus and a little bit of statistics as well. But they're testing you a little way further than just surface level on these topics. Like, for example, here it just wants you to see that you know how to calculate the roots of a polynomial, and then you just do some simple but annoying multiplication. But solving for these roots won't actually give you whole numbers. So that's something that you can already tell the test is trying to be a little bit tricky about.
और ABCD
question
क्या है?
number 2 is not too bad.
तो करके दिखाओ
Question
भैया।
number 3, also just a calculus problem. And especially when I saw this question number 6, it was pretty interesting. I'll include the answer key. I'll actually show you guys the answer key on the right side. It has a very, very logical and like
बाप रे, इतना टाइम लगेगा? 2 मिनट में हो जाएगा ये?
Solving it. It's just step by step, right? But the thing is, there are a lot of very specific steps involved, that just so many of these little things that, like, when it comes to crunch time, like, you might think of it, you might not think of it, and that's what makes this problem so hard.
Calculator allowed है?
An optimization problem. There are so many simple, like, sort of niche steps that you have to take in order to get this problem right. And something like question number 8 that requires you to have an understanding of matrices. In high school math in the United States, even if you go up to calculus, you probably won't see something like this. So this is an example of the JEE just having a very large scope of things that you need to know. Like, honestly, some of this stuff, I feel like there's no need for you to know it in high school, but that's beyond me. And then as you go further on the tests, especially when I got to, like,
last one,
section number 3, like this thing, Look at how disgusting this looks. Look at how long and disgusting this problem is. I'm gonna put the answer key up. This solution is probably also very long, tricky, confusing, and disgusting.
Matrix का
This is
determinant
pretty
कर
bad.
रहा है.
I wouldn't even attempt that. I wouldn't even attempt this type of problem because, to be frank, it's quite difficult. I would say that most of these problems on section 3 are just quite difficult for someone who doesn't have a very, very, very strong grasp on math. And I took calculus in high school. I took calculus 1 and calculus 2 in college, right? But section number 3 really requires you to have a little bit more of an understanding of math and some of the trickier topics that people normally like to just glaze over, or when they test you on, like, will test you on easier problems. So I'm gonna say that section number 1 and 2 difficulty level, I'll say, in terms of concepts, is pretty simple. In terms of the actual questions, maybe a 6.5 out of 10. But section 3, the concepts are pretty tricky, and the actual difficulty, I might give a 9 out of 10.
मतलब बहुत ही tough है.
9 out of 10. Not 10 out of 10. So
Now,
it is.
moving on to physics, I also haven't taken physics in a couple years, but straight off the bat, I can see that it tests you on probably even a deeper level than a lot of college physics classes will test you on. Here, like, this type of
12 के
problem
बाद दे
that's
रहे हैं.
not straight up just a ball laying on a curve, but actually has is actually indented a little bit into this plank, is a much trickier problem than just a ball on a plank. But you can also see that there's a mix of very doable questions along these, like, harder questions. Like, question number 2 is
Not
very
all
tricky
questions are impossible. Some are
nor is
impossible.
question number 3. And when you move on and see more of the test, you'll see that a lot of these questions, they mix in, like, simpler questions like question number 5 with more tricky questions. Especially question number 6 is something that you'll see a lot on, like, US college level physics tests,
sure.
and it's a pretty standard problem. And you can definitely see that the JEE physics has quite a broad scope. You can see some of this like thermal physics right over here that goes over things like radiation. You can see here that there's like a little bit of quantum physics. That's what it looks like. Like, these aren't, some of these topics you don't touch on very closely in high school, and like you have to wait till you get a little deeper into college to do this. Like, even question number 10, a pattern that I'm starting to see a lot is that on the JEE, they don't necessarily test you on the hardest concepts. They just test you on trickier versions of the simpler concept. That's a very apparent thing with question number 10. I think that even on a college level physics exam, they probably wouldn't test you on this unless they wanted to be mean.
That means ये JEE वाले बहुत mean है.
Same with 11.
बाप रे.
Same with
एक से
12.
दूसरे में जा रहा है क्या?
This isn't a topic that I'm all that familiar with. Yeah, you can
Spring
see here
problem.
that a lot of these problems, once again, not the trickiest
मैं तो question ही नहीं
concepts. They
समझ में
are
आने. मेरा तो
topics
ये हाल
that you
होगा.
learn how to do when you're taking something like AP Physics in high school. But it's very likely that when you're actually testing on this, they will give you easier versions of these problems than they do here. Except on the JEE, they actually test you in depth on the trickier versions of these problems, which is what makes this exam just so
इसमें
difficult.
multiple choice ही नहीं है. Section 3 है क्या
If I
ये?
were to rate this
हैं?
test, I would, the physics section difficulty,
Difficulty.
yes, I would give it also
My
a
God.
9 out of 10.
बहुत ही ज़्यादा.
Not because it's topics that you've never seen or it's like impossible to do,
Physics.
but it actually requires you to have a very strong grasp on these concepts
Concepts.
in order to do it. It's not just like a lot of these problems aren't just 1 or 2 step simple problems or like your
Multiple
standard,
choice भी
like,
नहीं है.
physics problems. They're variations on your standard physics problems, which make them much more difficult.
Chemistry. बाप रे. हमें तो सब दिया होगी.
Now, moving on to the chemistry section, the first thing I noticed was that, first of all, we didn't necessarily learn all that much about the topics that you went over, the topics that question number 1 covers, right? But this is an example
Chemistry में
of
कैसे
how,
आ गया?
ये क्या
I
है?
guess, a lot of the JE is also just test-taking skills. If you know that the most probable and the average speeds are in a 1-to-1 ratio, and that almost right off the bat eliminates A, C, and D, giving B to be the correct answer, which is not too tricky. I think if you look at this, like this is writing out a chemical equation, this is identifying precipitates and what's soluble and what's insoluble. So far, the chemistry is not very tricky at all.
तो
This is
केमिस्ट्री का
actually
कुछ याद ही नहीं.
like AP chemistry level stuff.
Oh,
So
अच्छा.
technically first and second year college stuff, but there are some kids that learn this in high school. However, something like question number 4, question number 5, straight off the bat, this is organic chemistry.
Sure.
Like even for a college organic chemistry course, some of these Newton projections aren't even the simplest. They're not even the most standard ones, which shows you that even if these tests test simple topics, on the JEE they like to give you complex versions of these simple topics. For example, here this Newton projection, I'll just draw it like this. A lot of people wouldn't be able to see it straight off the bat. I think that this one is
मैं
trying.
तो पता ही नहीं कर क्या रहा है. मुझे केमिस्ट्री याद ही नहीं कुछ. इतना लेवल तो किया ही नहीं होगा मैंने.
I definitely know people that would have struggled a lot to,
इसको तो याद है, मतलब हो सकता है कर रहा होगा अभी कॉलेज में.
without a doubt. But
मैंने
yeah,
आंसर कर
like,
लिया.
you can see that the JEE is testing you on a lot of organic chemistry.
Organic
so now
chemistry.
I actually participated in chemistry Olympiad in my
Oh,
time in
अच्छा.
high school, right?
I see.
And a lot
should
of
be
kids
good
were
at it.
really good at doing inorganic and physical chemistry, right? Which is what some of the first page tested you on, but didn't really have a lot of knowledge of organic chemistry, just because in high school in the United States, they don't really teach you organic chemistry. So while these aren't the most tricky chemistry problems,
पर पढ़ा नहीं हुआ.
a US chemistry student would definitely not be able to do this just because of the scope. The scope is much wider than in a US class. I think, in my opinion, the chemistry section is without a doubt the easiest section on this test. And I think that aside from the organic chemistry, which a college level organic chemistry student would be able to do without much difficulty, in conclusion, I think if you took away all the organic chemistry problems in this test, the difficulty might be like a 5.5 out of 10. Very typical for what an AP chemistry student would see. But because the AP chemistry is included, and that just includes a huge scope of things that like you probably would have never learned in high school, the difficulty is probably a 9.
वाह, काफ़ी टफ है. और रीज़न बीइंग, तो मेरे को तो ये नहीं समझ में आता कि अगर इतना जो कॉलेज लेवल की भी चीज़ें हैं उससे बियॉन्ड जा रही हैं, तो फिर भाई तुम ये कैसे इंडिया में एक्सपेक्ट कर रहे हैं कि हाई स्कूल में 12वीं का बच्चा जो है वो इनको आंसर्स कर सके. क्योंकि मैंने भी साइंस ली हुई थी, पर हाँ, पर मैंने ये नहीं लिया हुआ था ना, मैंने फिज़िक्स केमिस्ट्री नहीं ली हुई थी. पर मैं ये सोच रही हूँ कि इतना हाई लेवल स्कूल में तो नहीं पढ़ाते होंगे, इसी वजह से शायद बच्चे जो है वो जाते नहीं है कि ट्रेनिंग तो
सबसे
जगह
बड़ी
जगह.
प्रॉब्लम हमारे टाइम में ये थी कि स्कूल में आपको नहीं पढ़ाते थे जो IIT मांग रहा है.
हाँ, वो तो नहीं होता.
स्कूल में नहीं पढ़ाते थे.
वो बुक्स का ही नहीं पढ़ाते थे, कई बार तो टीचर्स ऐसे बेकार
स्कूल
थे.
में आपको नहीं पढ़ाते थे. उनकी
खुद पढ़ना पड़ता
एक्सपेक्टेशन
था.
थी कि इंसान जो है ट्यूशन के लिए जाएगा, प्राइवेट लोगों को हजारों अपना करोड़ों पैसा देगा और वहाँ सीखेगा और फिर IIT में जाएगा, जो पूरा सिस्टम ही फ्लॉड है. मतलब एक साधारण इंसान जो है जो स्कूल जाता है, ही कैन नेवर गो टू IIT. क्यों? क्योंकि उसको पढ़ा ही नहीं रहे. वो किताब देगा, किताब में नहीं है.
किताब में वो मटेरियल नहीं होता था.
तभी इतने कोचिंग सेंटर्स इंडिया में पॉपुलर हैं, जो गलत चीज़ है. अगर आप स्कूल में पढ़ा दो तो कोचिंग सेंटर की क्या जरूरत है?
और जो ये बोल रहे थे ना, ये जो बोल रहे थे एपी केमिस्ट्री और वो सब, वो एपी केमिस्ट्री जो होती है वो कॉलेज लेवल के होते हैं, जो कई एडवांस स्टूडेंट्स लेके वो करते हैं, तो हाई स्कूल में लेते हैं. तो वो ये बता रहे हैं कि वो कॉलेज लेवल का अगर कोई बच्चा स्कूल में कर रहा हो, वो इसमें से कोई कुछ क्वेश्चंस कर सकेगा, पर ऑर्गेनिक केमिस्ट्री के फिर भी नहीं कर पाएगा क्योंकि वो नहीं होता. तो बहुत ही हाई लेवल की टेस्टिंग कर रहे हैं ये लोग.
इशू सिर्फ ये, आप बताइए कि आजकल के जमाने में जो स्कूल में पढ़ा रहे हैं, अगर बच्चा सिर्फ इतना ही पढ़े
तो क्या वो IIT एग्जाम दे सकेगा कि नहीं? क्वेश्चन ये है. होना तो चाहिए. हाँ, आजकल हमारे
जमाने में तो इम्पॉसिबल था, क्योंकि आपको कोचिंग में जाना पड़ेगा. कोचिंग वालों का जरिया था पैसा कमाने का, और आपको लूटने का।
बिल्कुल।
अगर यही चीज़ वो स्कूल में पढ़ा देते, दे वुड नॉट हैव बीन प्रॉब्लम फॉर मोस्ट ऑफ द चिल्ड्रन।
क्वेश्चन यही है।
क्वेश्चन ये, आज भी अगर यही हो रहा है तो फिर धंधा चल रहा है कि स्कूल में पढ़ाओ नहीं, बाद में कोचिंग वालों पढ़ाएंगे तुम्हें।
बिल्कुल, पर इससे साफ क्लियर हो रहा है कि इट इज प्रिटी टफ। ऑब्वियसली वो तो हमें पहले ही पता था, प्रिटी टफ क्या, बहुत टफ होगा। पर
अगर आप किसी को पढ़ाते हैं और कोई डेडिकेटली पढ़ता है तो उसके लिए सब कुछ पॉसिबल है।
वो तो है भैया, दिमाग साथ में चाहिए। तो चलो बताना कि क्या स्कूल की पढ़ाई के साथ अगर खाली जाए कोई बच्चा तो क्या वो ये एग्जाम दे सकेगा और क्लियर कर पाएगा कि नहीं। दैट इज द मेन थिंग। तो बताना। तो चलो चलते हैं, मिलेंगे नेक्स्ट वीडियो में बहुत ही जल्द। टिल देन टेक केयर एंड बाय बाय।
तो अगर आप मेरे इस चैनल पे नए हो तो जल्दी से सब्सक्राइब के बटन को हिट करो और बेल आइकन को क्लिक करो ताकि आपको मेरा जब नया वीडियो मैं लगाऊं आपको उसके बारे में जल्दी से पता चल जाए।